Dumbledore suddenly stopped speaking, and it was apparent to everybody what had distracted him. The fire in the goblet had just turned red again. Sparks were flying out of it. A long flame shot suddenly into the air, and borne upon it was another piece of parchment. Automatically, it seemed, Dumbledore reached out a long hand and seized the parchment. He held it out and stared at the name written upon it. There was a long pause, during which Dumbledore stared at the slip in his hands, and everyone in the room stared at Dumbledore. And then Dumbledore cleared his throat and read out, Harry Potter. Welcome to the Book Club podcast. I'm Carly, and I'm an Elder Millennial. And today my guest is Jenni, returning for her second episode. Today we are discussing Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire by J.K. Rowling. Welcome, Jenni.
Hi, Carly. It's great to be here. I started reading the series in high school, the Harry Potter series in high school, a few years after the first book came out. After initially refusing to read Harry Potter. When I first picked up the first book, there were names like Dudley, and it seemed so juvenile. I refused to read it. But then once my sister, who's 4 years younger, also refused to read it, I was like, oh, well, maybe I should look again. And then I read the first book in less than 24 hours. And then I continued reading each book as they came out. So I would have read The Goblet of Fire initially my senior year of high school, and then continued to revisit the story on audiobook and long car rides and things like that from there.
Yeah. So I think I remember my mom bought the first book for someone else, but that person already had the book, so it was just in her house, and so I picked it up. And yeah, I thought it was pretty juvenile, but I liked reading, younger fantasy anyway, and so I went through all four books because they were out at that time. And that was the same year that the first movie came out. So I had a friend at my summer job who loved Harry Potter. And so we both came to college in Santa Fe, and she invited me with her friends to go see the movie when it came out. And I remember talking to you about it a lot throughout college and the years afterwards. I remember we took a road trip across Texas and we listened to, I think it was the fifth book on CD. And I remember seeing this movie, the Goblet of Fire movie, with another classmate of ours when it came out after we graduated college. It was just always around. And I remember being so excited when the books would come out, and I would just read it as soon as I could. And it was interesting. I never got online. I'm sure there were plenty of online forums talking about it at that time, but there were plenty of people just around who were reading it. And I remember hearing people talking about Harry Potter in the dining hall or something, or you know what I mean? Like, it's just such a big part of the millennial experience in high school and college. And I couldn't leave Harry Potter off of the season if I was talking about millennials and books that affected millennials, because it was such a big part of us. I remember some news story saying that Harry Potter taught millennials to love to read. Like how many people in our generation would not have become readers if it wasn't for Harry Potter? I don't know. I would have been a reader regardless, but we'll talk about this book in particular, Goblet of Fire, but we are going to spoil the whole series. I want to be able to talk freely about anything that happens in the series, books or movies, or even rumors of not canon stuff that about like the wizarding world. Like anything is fair game in this conversation. And then just real quick before we start with a summary of this one book, I just want to acknowledge that so many people have felt hurt and betrayed by comments that J.K. Rowling has made. And we're not going to talk about that in depth, but I did want to acknowledge that people have this deep betrayal for this author. And I want to repeat something that another friend of mine said, that the actions of the author don't have to impact your experience, your history, the joy that you found in the books, in the works that author has created. And so that's part of this discussion too, is reconnecting with that joy that we felt when we first read these books, and revisiting some of how that has impacted us as we have grown up. This Harry Potter book begins, like all the other Harry Potter books, with Harry being at the Dursley house for the summer. We spend enough time there to see that Harry has learned how to manipulate his uncle. The Weasleys quickly come to take him to the Quidditch World Cup at a campground hidden by the Ministry of Magic. All of the Weasley children, plus Harry and Hermione, attend the World Cup. They watch Victor Crumb, the Bulgarian seeker, catch the snitch, although the Ireland team wins. And that night, they are woken up by sounds of terror. They see a group of wizards wearing masks tormenting the Muggle family that manage the campground. Mr. Weasley tells the children to hide in the woods while he helps the Ministry deal with the Death Eaters, who are the people in masks. Harry, Ron, and Hermione see someone summon the Dark Mark using Harry's stolen wand, and they quickly return to the Weasleys' home. Their first night back at Hogwarts, they meet the new dark arts teacher, Mad-Eye Moody, a retired Auror, aka Dark Wizard Catcher, aka Wizard Law Enforcement. He has a magic blue eye that spins around independent of his real eye, and he also has a wooden leg. Dumbledore announces that the Tri-Wizard Tournament will be hosted at Hogwarts that year, and they will have guests from 2 other wizarding schools, Durmstrang with Headmaster Karkaroff, and Beauxbaton with Headmaster Madame Maxine.
The champions from each school are chosen by a magical object, the Goblet of Fire. Students write their name on a piece of parchment and put it in the Goblet of Fire, which creates a binding magical contract. Students under the age of 17 aren't allowed to participate. The goblin spits out the names of Fleur Delacour from Beauxbaton, Victor Crumb from Durham, and Cedric Diggory from Hogwarts. Then the goblet spits out a piece of parchment with Harry Potter's name. After a lot of discussion and some concern that someone wants to harm Harry by entering into this dangerous contest, they determine that he will be allowed to compete despite being too young. Ron gives Harry the silent treatment because he believes that Harry cheated to enter the contest. Most of the school agrees with Ron. Hagrid shows Harry the 4 dragons that the champions will face at the first task. Madame Maxine and Karkaroff also see the dragons, so Harry guesses that the only champion who doesn't know about them is Cedric. He catches Cedric between classes to let him know about the dragons. Moody witnesses this and gives Harry some advice on how to defeat the dragon. Harry gets Hermione to help him master summoning spells so that he can get his broom to steal the golden egg from the dragon. After seeing how dangerous the task was, Ron stops giving Harry the silent treatment, and they become friends again.
Over the Christmas break, there's the Tri-Wizard Tournament Yule Ball, and Harry and Ron find themselves scrambling to find partners. Ron asks Hermione to go with him and says Ginny can go with Harry, but both Hermione and Ginny have been asked to go by other people, so Ron and Harry go with Padma and Parvati Patil. At the dance, they discover that Hermione is Victor Crumb's partner, and Ron is extremely rude about it. Cedric repays the favor to Harry by giving him a hint on how to interpret the clue for the second task, which will require the champions to retrieve something that was stolen from them at the bottom of the lake from the Mer people. Harry sneaks out in the middle of the night to take a bath in the prefect's bathroom where he can listen to the clue underwater. On his way back to his dorm, he sees Barty Crouch on the Marauders map in Snape's office and goes to investigate. He gets stuck on a trick step and attracts the attention of Snape, Filch, and Moody. Again, Moody does not punish Harry for breaking the rules, but covers for him with Snape. He asks to borrow the Marauders map. The champions visit the Quidditch field where they find a hedge maze growing. They are told that the first champion to grab the Triwizard Cup at the center of the maze will win the tournament. Afterward, Harry and Victor talk at the edge of the forest where Barty Crouch emerges, clearly not in his right mind. Harry runs to get Dumbledore, but by the time they return, they find Crumb stunned and Crouch gone.
The maze during the final task, Harry finds Crumb attacking Cedric. He helps Cedric, then Cedric helps him fight a giant spider. They agree to take the goblet together to tie for champion. As they touch the cup, they realize it's a portkey. They find themselves in a graveyard that Harry recognizes from his dreams. Wormtail kills Cedric immediately. He performs a spell using his own hand and Harry's blood to bring Voldemort back to full power. Voldemort summons his remaining Death Eaters and duels with Harry. Harry and Voldemort's wands lock together in a magical binding. Previous spells are extracted from Voldemort's wand. Harry sees the spirit of Cedric emerge from the wand. Cedric asks Harry to take his body back to his parents. Then the spirits of Harry's parents come out of Voldemort's wand. They tell him that when he breaks the connection, they will distract Voldemort and he must run to the cup so that it can take him back to Hogwarts. He manages to reach Cedric's body and uses a summoning spell to bring the cup to him. It takes him back outside the maze where the crowd was watching the final task of the tournament. In the confusion, he finds himself being led away by Moody.
It's revealed that Barty Crouch Jr. was using Polyjuice Potion to impersonate Moody the entire school year. He helped Harry win so that Harry would be delivered to Voldemort. Dumbledore finds them along with Snape and McGonagall. He finds the real Moody trapped in a trunk. Snape brings Rita serum to get Barty Crouch Jr. to explain how his father helped him escape from Azkaban to keep him prisoner at home for many years. He escaped his father's imprisonment with the help of Voldemort and Wormtail. After that, Dumbledore takes Harry to his office where he tells Dumbledore and Sirius everything that happened in the graveyard. Then Dumbledore takes him to the hospital wing where Mrs. Weasley, Ron, and Hermione are waiting. They are disturbed by the minister, Cornelius Fudge, who had a Dementor suck the soul out of Barty Crouch Jr. Dumbledore tells Fudge that Voldemort is back, but Fudge refuses to believe him. After Fudge leaves, Dumbledore asks Mrs. Weasley, Snape, and Sirius if they will work with him to fight Voldemort and the Death Eaters. At the feast ending the school year, Dumbledore gives a eulogy for Cedric Diggory and tells the students that he was murdered by Voldemort. Harry returns to the Dursley house with a promise from Mrs. Weasley that he will be able to join them later in the summer. So, Jenny, you have an opening question for us.
Yeah. So why don't the wizards know how to dress like muggles? Or the way this question first came to me is, what do wizards wear under their robes? We encounter a lot of really strange clothing choices in this novel. Everything from like Rita Skeeter's magenta robe with her crocodile handbag, or wizards at the Quidditch World Cup wearing a poncho with a kilt, or even Ron's fancy dress robes for the Yule Ball. So if wizards are all around us, how do they not know how to dress like muggles?
Yes, I like this question. I mean, there's so much to this book is so rich. There's so much that I could include in the summary. And so all of these little details that just fill out the world, they just make the book so enjoyable. So we start out at the Quidditch World Cup, and first of all, compared to the first three books, this fourth book is so much bigger just physically than the first three books. And we get that glimpse into the wizarding world outside of Hogwarts. And I remember just being super excited to learn about that. Like, what's happening outside of Hogwarts? Who are all these people? And I loved learning about the broader world. But yeah, the wizards are so disconnected from the muggles, even though I think it's mentioned that there's one little town. Oh, it's the town outside of the school is one of the few
Hogsmeade.
Hogsmeade, yes. It's one of the few completely wizarding towns, right? Like other types of creatures will go visit there because it's one of the few places where they can go and be seen. And so we know that wizards are living next door to muggles all the time, and yet they still don't know how to put on a pair of jeans. And I want to make this connection between, how separated the muggles are from the wizards, and also how now with social media and the algorithm, the mysterious algorithms that show you things that you want to know already, there's a siloing of people, because of the way media works now. And you can have people who live next door to each other, who shop at the same store and see each other every day, and yet they have completely different views of what's going on in the world because they get their information from different sources. And I wonder if there's a parallel there, that it is actually possible to be physically in the same place with people and also alienated from them.
I mean, I've always felt that you see what you value, and right now I'm thinking even at the very end of the novel Dumbledore is talking to Harry about the mysterious death, and um, Dumbledore reads the Muggle news, and he found out about the death of the uh,
Frank Bryce.
yeah, Frank. What role does he serve? I keep wanting to say
Gardner?
gamekeeper. That's not it, but Gardner. Yes, he's the Gardner. um, Dumbledore is paying attention to those Muggle deaths, but when he brings that to the attention of other wizards, they are very dismissive. I think the wizards are rather self-centered. I mean, the extreme is the Death Eaters, but to a lesser extent, um, most wizards aren't concerned about them at all. In fact, the only real Muggle lover we hear about is Mr. Weasley, and
Yeah.
he's considered a complete eccentric.
Is he though? I mean, I know that like Draco likes to tease Ron about that, but Draco's father is a Death Eater. Like and it seems like there's a generational difference. Like the younger people know how to dress like Muggles. It's their parents and older who have a real struggle with it. And I wonder how much the war with Voldemort, the previous war with Voldemort and talking about pure blood, did that wake people up like Dumbledore? It's been so long since I've read the other books that I don't remember exactly. Like, when did Dumbledore start reading the Muggle paper? Was it after Voldemort rose to power the first time? Because he's starting to think about, this whole like pure blood and the separation that Voldemort advocates. Did Dumbledore react to that by being like, no, wait, actually, we should be more concerned about the rights of other creatures and Muggles?
Possibly. I also just feel like Dumbledore is just a character that does all things. It's I feel like the author really goes out of her way to say that Dumbledore, while he has his shortfalls, is capable and interested in everything.
Yeah.
um, but you're making me think of one of the later books that actually starts with a minister of magic in a Muggle government office. He goes to see the prime minister to say, "Hey, we have a problem." But the division is still very clear between the two. I mean, you can't do magic in front of Muggles. In some of the other movies, there's this whole branch of the ministry dedicated to making sure Muggles don't see or remember magic.
Right. I know there's a whole bunch of lore about it. It's not really told in this story about Harry Potter, but like why the wizards had to be in hiding. And you'd think that if it was so crucial, so important to that the whole wizarding community has agreed that they have to be in hiding from the Muggles, that they would learn how to actually be in hiding. Like at the World Cup, the Ministry wizards are like running around trying to stop people from doing spells where the Muggles could see them, the Muggles who run the campsite, and just like doing these memory spells on them over and over and over again to like make them forget. It's like there's a real hubris there of like, oh yeah, we're not supposed to do magic in front of the Muggles, but if we do, whatever, we just erase their memory.
Yeah, well, there's a power imbalance. Like the wizards really do have capabilities that the Muggles don't, and I think it's short sighted. But they're also like, oh well. But yeah, I think it is interesting how you can exist in the same space and have no connection with the other people around you. So I
Yeah.
think it shows that pretty clearly. I mean, Hermione eyeing all of these wizards and what they're wearing, or even trying to give them some subtle advice. Like, oh, you maybe wouldn't want to put those together.
Yeah. With Rita Skeeter, though, she has a fashion sense, but it's like a wizard fashion sense. It seems like whenever Rita is mentioned, it's also mentioned that she's wearing something brightly colored, right? Like there's a point to wearing something. We always know what she's wearing. So, like, what do you think is
Mhm.
going on with that?
I mean, she's certainly portrayed as being like sharp and perceptive, and I imagine her being like very fashion forward. And I might be influenced by the movies some here, but she's always wearing something bright. And now, like at the end of the book, when you realize she's a animagus and she's a beetle, you think of those shimmery colors on the beetles, the iridescent. So I think Rowling might be giving us little hints about that iridescence with her brightly colored clothing.
Oh, interesting. Just like the flash of color that you see when you see a beetle scuttling around.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I'm thinking about right now. But also a flashy dressed wizard, even in the Muggle world, would probably command a degree of respect. She's, she's probably it's a power move for Rita for sure.
Yes, and that power comes from something kind of underhanded, I want to say. She's able to get these stories because she's breaking the law and she's sneaking around. And it's not a power like Dumbledore's power or like even McGonagall's power, that there's a lot of integrity.
No, she's mean and nasty. That was
Yeah.
something that also struck me throughout the novel, is that our three heroes are regularly encountering these people that are straight up mean and nasty. And I feel like Rita falls into that category. I feel like she does it out of selfishness. She makes a living out of writing nasty things about people that sell papers. Um, and so she really has no shame um, as she interviews people and makes things up and goes for that kind of unauthorized story.
Just seeing the trend of journalism over the last couple of decades. I mean, I have a journalism degree, so just seeing how these sort of high ideals that I was taught in journalism school about how to tell a story and how to like try to verify your information. And a lot of those practices have gone away, right? Like even in the most respected newspapers, you'll see overuse of anonymous sources and it's just bad journalism. And it's interesting that there's Rita Skeeter as an example of a journalist who's aggrandizing herself rather than telling a story and just making stuff up, like just telling lies. And then when she does find something that's true, like the story about Hagrid being a half giant, using that to ruin someone's life. Like why is it anyone's business? Like she uses this banner of like the people have a right to know, right? Like they need to know that if their kids are at school with a half giant. It's like, do they? Like, well, Hagrid's a complicated case, but it's just like the worst possible way of addressing Hagrid's capability as a teacher is just to call him a half giant and then let the angry letters come in, you know?
I mean, I think it comes back to something that we're facing every day now, and that, you know, wild stories sell paper, they sell news. It's all about the marketing and kind of the wealth of that industry. So it's hard not to read an article and then go through and have to fact check it, and using ground news, and so that I can see, oh, who is covering this story? How factual is it? Because to a degree, that that machine kind of generates a shared experience for people. It kind of, in some ways, it's like a stabilizer, or I that's not quite the right word. But like even Miss Weasley is affected by Rita's article in Witch Weekly about Hermione. Um,
Right. Right.
and
A girl
then,
who stayed at her own house.
yeah, Cornelius Fudge is affected by what he's reading. Like these people in power are affected by what they're reading. And the ministry goes on to use the newspaper as a tool for kind of hiding information and manipulating society as the novels go on. So Rita is certainly not put out as a upstanding journalist. You know, she's not doing um, that career any favor, that business any good.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and just one more thing about Rita Skeeter, like she creates conspiracy theories and conspiracy theories have been a big part. Like I thought that was interesting that she's able to drum up these whole conspiracy theories.
That kind of plays to Voldemort's hand. You know, he certainly uses, um, he uses fear to his advantage. He knows how to manipulate people using fear. I think as things continue from this point on, this is the book where I feel like the kids' gloves are off. Everything else, like moving forward in the series, becomes life and death, or, you know, society is facing a huge problem.
The death of Cedric is so shocking. He's just an innocent student, the most innocent bystander of innocent bystanders, right? And he's just killed. Um, and we were in our 20s when we read this book, but I really wonder for the younger millennials if that affected them in any way. Do you have thoughts on like young middle school age kids, teenagers reading about death in this way?
I think it certainly affects a reader when a character that you've gotten to know over, you know, a bit of time is just needlessly killed, especially somebody that's as stand up as Cedric is. You don't fall in love with him, but he's also an okay guy. So for him to be murdered with no reason or um, pomp and circumstance, like there's no gravity to his murder, it's just boom, dead.
Yeah.
And we move on. That's really challenging. But also, I think reading about death affects us differently at different ages because your life experiences play into it. So even younger millennials or kids who pick up the novel for the first time and read it today may or may not dwell on that death to the same degree.
Yeah.
But we're also living in a world with school shootings and things like that, where innocent people just are taken from you instantly because someone else has a problem.
Yeah. Well, can't say that Cedric's death affected me, but reading through this book, I've never read these books out of order. I always would restart when a new book was coming out. I would start back at the beginning and reread all the previous books in preparation for the new book to come out. So I've read them all many times, except for the last one. And in the last one, there are a lot of deaths. And I know you mentioned this too. You had the same experience where you're reading about these characters in this book and you know which ones are going to die in that battle in the seventh book. And that did affect me a bit reading this.
It definitely influenced my reading of this one. I haven't gone back and reread the later books as much as I read the early books, like books 1 through 3. And so revisiting this one after many years of not reading Harry Potter, it's hard to read the playful banter between Fred and George knowing that you're going to lose one of them. Even reading about Hedwig or Dobby, all of these different characters that we lose, I got a little sad every time I'd read about one of those characters. I couldn't really focus on them as these new, fresh, lively characters anymore.
Yeah.
Like their future death kind of overshadowed my current reading.
Yeah. I mean, the ones that got me, it was Dennis and Colin Creevey, and I think it's the skill of the storytelling to have such a layered and rich world where Dennis and Colin Creevey are just like in the background, but they're consistently there in the background. And so, there's that scene in the last book where Harry walks through the Great Hall and sees all of the casualties, and it's just like hit after hit after hit of like, oh, this person's gone, this person's gone. Because we've had so many years and so many books of these folks just being around, it does feel like a loss. I mean, I've experienced real grief and real loss in my life since these books came out, and it's the grief from a story is completely different for me than grief I've experienced in real life. But I don't know how well established it is, the idea that people who read fiction have empathy, like it's a way of practicing empathy, immersing yourself in stories and learning about these imaginary people. I haven't seen a direct connection between reading stories where there's loss and grief and my real life experience of it. But I do wonder if there was some kind of preparation or some kind of resilience from reading these books when I was young and then having loss in my life later.
Yeah, it's like just a light inoculation. Like every time it's like Like taking your mind and your emotions and your body through like a little practice dealing with loss. I think reading fiction helps build your ability to look at situations from different perspectives as you read a variety of different books and different fiction, especially depending on what point of view the author takes. Even in this one, it's like, well, you can see Harry's perspective about being suddenly this champion in the Triwizard Tournament. You can also see Ron's very clearly. Like we have this outside perspective where it makes it really easy to understand the motivations and the actions of our characters. You know, to the point where you're out there, you're with Hermione, come on, Ron, just talk to him, or Harry, just talk to Ron. Uh, because I think those perspectives and characters are just developed really well. But I think, we're getting definitely into the last book, but all of this is happening in such a small community. There's a world of wizards. All of these battles, especially between Harry and Voldemort, are fought on this very small space. You're intimate with all of the characters involved, even at this level midway through the series. Um, Cedric because he was the seeker for the Hufflepuff Quidditch team. So we've been building these relationships, and instead of this being a war that's being fought in another country, it's a war that's being fought in a very intimate place.
Yeah.
Even though it affects all of the wizarding world.
Well, I think that goes back to these books being like growing with the reader as the reader grows. Like you start when you're 11, and then as you mature, the books mature. But it's all within this framework of the school, and the framing of the stories are consistent, right? Like you begin
Mhm.
at the Dursleys in the summer, and there's the Christmas vacation always. There's the Quidditch, but in this book, it's the tournament, and then the reveal, right? Because there's always a mystery element to the story, so then the mystery has to be solved. And I always enjoyed that too. I always enjoyed trying to figure out the clues and solve the mystery. And in this book, the mystery is Moody is actually not Moody, it's always, and the dark arts teacher is only going to be there for 1 year, and it's like, why is Moody going to leave? Moody's great. Oh, you have to figure out what's going to cause the dark arts teacher to leave. Like those repeating, what would they be called? Tropes, structures to the story. I think that's part of setting up a young person with literacy, right? Like with the ability to really sink into a story and get something out of it is providing these handrails.
It's like, okay, I know when I sit down to read Harry Potter, it might start with some event, but I know it's going to be summer. I know we're going to go to Hogwarts. I know that there's going to be something fishy about the defense of the dark arts teacher. Um, and even though usually the beginning of the novel kind of develops Ron and Hermione and Harry and their friendships and their character, by the time we get to Christmas break, they're going to be working hard to solve some problem.
Right.
And we're trying to solve that problem along with them. I think from Harry's perspective, the big question is who put my name in the goblet and how am I going to survive this? But then the answer ends up being so much bigger than Harry would have ever guessed. I really loved reading the reveal chapter in Goblet of Fire this time. Listening to Barty Crouch Jr. tell how he did everything was just amazing. You're like, oh yeah, you can pick up all of those clues. You can see how it worked, even though everything seemed like it was coming from somewhere else. It really fell into place nicely that no, he could have been there. He could have done that. It's just barely believable,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
part of what makes it fun.
Yeah. Well, and he has a misstep. I think it's really interesting. I mean, that moment with Neville just broke my heart this time in, their first class with Moody or whatever, when they're going over the unforgivable curses. and Neville has such a strong reaction, and that's when we learn, I think it's just barely mentioned, that Neville's parents were tortured with the Cruciatus curse. And I think I wrote in my notes this time, I was like, this is a kid's book? Like, we're talking about a poor 14-year-old boy grieving his parents who were tortured, and then Moody gives him a book of plants. When the first time you read it, you're like, oh, Moody, he is a decent person. I mean, he's like a weird guy because he's like so crazy about catching dark wizards, but he's a good person, and yes, it's okay, he's a teacher, right? Even though he's showing them illegal curses. Like, and he
Mhm.
puts
Well,
he puts
but as a student, that's exciting. You're like, oh.
sure. Yes, exactly. I don't think Dumbledore knew about that. but
I
but
don't
then
think he did either.
yeah, and then at the end it's revealed, oh, that's why Moody never gets Harry into trouble. Like, it's, yeah, putting that all together. Now, there's something we've been kind of talking about, like revisiting, right? Like, we know the series, we know how it ends. We're revisiting the book. What does that do with nostalgia? Like, going back to a book that you've read. I mean, I like to reread books. I read them over and over again. I get a lot out of it. Well, especially good books that have many layers. You get a lot out of multiple readings. But going back to something that you loved when you were a lot younger, I don't know. I feel, is there more to say about that? Do you have anything to add about that? Like, what is this experience of the story stays the same? These characters are alive in this book, but we know later on that some of them are not. And just like trying to grasp, like, what does that do for us?
I think it makes it a little bittersweet. Kind of like thinking about your own childhood is a little bittersweet because things have been lost and broken along the way. Experiences you have evolve with perspective as you get older. And with a book like Harry Potter or a series like Harry Potter, um, where you get so close to the characters, I think it's especially poignant because if it's a book that's more about maybe an adventure or a particular experience. You know, I read The Giver with you for an earlier podcast, and the theme of that book is what really affects me as I'm reading it. And so it didn't bring back nostalgia for me. It just made me revisit the theme of the book, which is really powerful. Whereas with Harry Potter, I've developed a relationship with all of these characters. So the things they experience affect me more like spending time with a friend that I haven't seen in a while, as
Yeah.
opposed to a bigger idea.
Yeah.
Because the theme in Harry Potter is very much light versus darkness, love versus fear. That's a very broad theme that I hardly ever have any deep thoughts about. But the characters, you fall in love with the characters. You want to know how they are and what they're doing. And I think maybe because you befriend them when you're young, you expect them to continue to have new experiences.
Hmm.
So when Harry Potter and the Cursed Child came out, I got a copy and I read it and I was kind of excited to see, oh, these characters ended up together. These characters have kids. You know, this is what their life is like now because it's about the characters instead of an issue.
Right. Instead of an idea, an abstract. Yeah.
Mhm.
One thing I wanted to mention was how they always break the rules. Like, in the first book, they start breaking the rules. And that always was like, that always stood out for me. I was like, these kids never follow the rules. And yet somehow that's the right thing to do. And I wonder if that has anything to tell us about the millennial mindset. I was recently with a group of mostly boomer age people, and they said something about millennials being entitled. And I was like, um, hi there, I'm a millennial. Like, are millennials entitled? No, I don't think so. But like, I wonder if that has something to do with, like, is there a generational difference in how millennials approach the so-called rules? And is that why we were called entitled and still are called entitled?
That's really funny because hearing you say that, I think, well, the boomers didn't have any rules. And then they made a lot of rules. I think about being an 80s kid, and all of the references now are that, you know, being a child in the 70s and 80s and 90s, your parents would just send you outside. Come back before dark. There
Yeah.
really wasn't a lot of oversight. Um, so that's a little different than what our characters are doing in this book, because they are constantly breaking the rules. But I feel like that's a part of childhood, but maybe all of these books we read when we were younger romanticized it, like
Hmm.
romanticized breaking the rules for us. But they generally have a good reason. They are well-meaning while they break the rules. It's always for a greater good.
Yes, but I think I'm trying to think of a specific example in Goblet of Fire, but I do know in some of the other books, they're putting themselves in real danger by breaking the rules, and they're just like, no, maybe because they're Gryffindor, like, no, I have to be the one who goes out and does the thing instead of telling the grown up who maybe is more capable of doing the thing. Like there's just so they are independent. Like they take on the responsibility for themselves of solving the mystery of the story, even though all the adults are telling them no. Like it's like ask for help, and they're like, no, we're just gonna do it.
It also kind of reinforces the idea that adults rarely understand young people and their concerns,
Hmm.
right? Because for some of this, if Harry Potter or Hermione would have been like, "Oh, there's a troll, and we've got to go get the troll," they'd be like, "No, there's not a troll here." They're just not believed a lot of the time, or they tell themselves that no one would believe them. So whether or not Professor McGonagall or Dumbledore would hear one of their issues and believe them, they've told themselves no one would believe this. So it's up to me to fix it.
Yeah. Yeah, that quote, it's in a later book. Dumbledore tells Harry, he apologizes to Harry and says, I, as an old person, I should remember what it's like to be young. I should have, and he's like, I should have treated you differently and had more compassion for you. And I've thought about that a lot, especially, you know, turning 40 and suddenly there are all these 20-year-olds telling us what to do and how we're parting our hair wrong and wearing the wrong clothes. And it's like, uh, excuse me. And beyond that, even, having more acceptance for people with different lifestyles, right? Like really having to question the biases that I didn't know I had. Like, wait, am I biased in this way? Like, so that Dumbledore quote really helped me. I've thought about it a lot when I'm confronted with something that's like the Gen Z says X, and I'm like, I don't dismiss things as quickly. It's like, oh, I remember being young in my early 20s and having this vision and hope for how the world should work, and being frustrated that the older people around me refused to believe that things could change for the better. It's like having
And
more
I think
respect for that.
we're facing that as we, try to deal with climate change. Many of the activists are very young.
Hmm.
Um, and so listening to those voices and respecting those voices, because the world's changing around us. And, um, you know, Dumbledore is also a rule breaker, because there's different levels of rules. There's the rules that keep you safe. There's the rules that are really just society's parameters about what's accepted and what's not. And sometimes those need to change. Those need to be broken, like the prejudice with Hagrid and Madame Maxine being part giant, the way house elves are treated. In some cases, I wouldn't say that all wizards are bad to their house elves, but we don't have really great examples. Werewolves, the prejudice against Lupin.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, they're breaking, Dumbledore is breaking those rules, those societal rules. So, I think it's just important to really examine all of the structures and all of the rules, because sometimes they break rules and do get hurt.
Yeah.
But you
Yeah.
just have to think about, like, why is this rule here? Um, and I think that's important for us in our everyday lives as well. And it's important to be bold enough to break those rules sometimes.
Sure. I mean, well, I really relate to Hermione, because when she finds out that house elves work in the kitchen that first night back at Hogwarts, and she just, like, stops eating, and then she's eating the next morning, and Ron kinda teases her about it, and she's like, "Well, I figured that there were better things I could do to fight for the rights of house elves," and Ron says, "Yeah, and you're hungry." I really relate to that because, I was working as a political activist in jobs that I had a strong mission and a strong passion for, but they didn't pay well. And at some point, I had to say, look, I need a job with a 401k and a healthcare plan. Like, I just can't continue working these low paying jobs because of a mission. My 20-year-old self would be appalled. It's like, but my perspective changed. So,
Yeah. It's hard to, live your life with every situation that you encounter having to try and cycle that perspective through different lenses. There's the immediate and myopic, and then spreading it out to how it affects other people, the world, your life over a longer period of time. Because, yeah, Hermione definitely has to face that. She gets all fired up, and then, she makes assumptions that, um, in some ways aren't hers to make. And so she has to, backpedal a bit, even though she's not wrong about some of these elves being mistreated. Some of them are, but she also can't tell the elves how to feel. So she's having to shift her perspective throughout the novel. And by the end, Spew just disappears.
no, it comes back in the next book. I remember it in the next book. Yeah. Are we ready to talk about genre themes?
Yeah, let's give it a shot.
So, first of all, genuine connection. With our first episode on One in a Millennial, we talked about how the internet has changed the way people connect to each other. And so I'm looking for, where does genuine connection show up in these books? And the thing that stands out to me is it's a fourth book. So Ron and Hermione and Harry have a strong connection. They are friends, and and Ron and Harry have a fight. And this happens more than once, where someone's fighting with someone, but they come back and they're friends again. And I think that's a really important example, because how do you form friendships that are that close, where that there's a freedom to fight and be mad at each other, right? Like, I feel like that's not something that I can say about friendships made as adults. It seems a lot harder to recover from a conflict, because it's so easy to just exit each other's lives. It takes more effort to stay with each other. So that's one example of connection.
Yeah. In Ron and Harry's situation, there's really nowhere else to go. And I think when you're younger, that's often the case. Like, you're just put back in front of that person over and over and over again in school or clubs or wherever you're friends. And that's true for Harry and Ron. And it's like their interaction has to be sustained for like a month of them not speaking to each other until, Ron gets jarred by the task with the dragon to go, "Oh man, that was crazy, and you did that," um, which brought them back together. And so they had time to cool off, and then they had an experience that brought them back together.
Hmm.
And I think now it's easier to walk away. It's easier to walk away as an adult because you have the autonomy to. But also with social media and technology, it's easy to hide away from an interaction with someone just behind a screen. You can still be in the same room for years and never
Yeah.
um, never get past those problems that you might have had.
Anything else to say about connection in this book?
The Triwizard Tournament is about bringing different parts of the wizarding world together. So I've always kind of liked the connection between Hermione and Crumb.
Mm.
It's these people who are from different schools. Uh, there's really no reason for Crumb to be interested in Hermione other than the fact that she is not following him around with goo goo eyes.
Yeah.
But it seems like they still have, like, he wouldn't have been in the library initially unless he maybe shared that commitment to studying and learning. Like, I think that's something they have in common beyond the fact that he didn't want an airhead. And here's this interesting fellow student who is just really focused. And I think he admires that focus. And we get to know Crumb a little bit. And he follows her around like a puppy dog, and she has no interest. But there's still a connection there that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I think it makes sense for a young athlete that I never thought about that before, that she is focused and he can see that. And as a young athlete, athletes have to be focused. And so that makes a lot of sense that he would be attracted to that. And then the fact that she's not chasing him around for an autograph, that I can also see that being very attractive to a young athlete as well, that I'm who's going to like me for me. And so of course the person who's not starstruck by him is going to stand out too. I
Or
find
the
that
prize that's hardest to catch.
yes, exactly. He's the seeker. Um
Uh, and that's different than Fleur Delacour, too, um, who knows she's beautiful, but we don't really see her connect with anyone until Harry and Ron at the lake. That's where it's like, oh, she's not just this ice queen. Like, we get to, she really loves her sister, and um, she is changed by that experience, and then develops a connection with Harry and Ron, um, and the Weasleys that goes on in the series. So I don't know. Those were little connection moments. Hagrid and Madame Maxine,
yeah.
that have shared life experiences.
Okay, female characters. It's always bugged me that Fleur does the worst in the tournament. Like, it's always just sat in the back of my mind of like, why is the one girl the one who's in last place? Like, that just always kind of nagged at me. I think the girls, I don't know. It seemed to me that Hermione had a lot of not like other girls syndrome. I hadn't noticed in previous readings where she gets annoyed with the Beauxbaton girls being cold. And it's like, they're from a warmer climate. Like, they're cold. I get that Hermione's young and I can forgive her for that. But like, I don't know if I forgive the overall book and its treatment of some of these female characters.
I think J.K. Rowling might really identify with Hermione, and there's probably a lot of feminine tendencies that she doesn't respect. And I feel that way from my childhood. I always tended more towards the tomboy style. I always took my studying very seriously. I never wore makeup. I never looked particularly nice because I was like, oh, that's not important. And I would roll my eyes at the cheerleaders. Um, and so I'm not proud of that feeling
Yeah.
because I probably did sideline a lot of really wonderful people. Um, but as a kid reading about these, I really loved Hermione. And I was completely sympathetic with all of her eye rolling at the other girls in the novel. Again, that's not something I feel good about, though, as an adult.
Yeah. No, I definitely sympathize. I mean, I was the book reading girl. Like, I don't know that I connected with the feminine girls either, right? I was just reading the book. I didn't pay much attention to my clothes. Um yeah, so I think I can sympathize. And actually, I just remember one of the movies was on TV one day and I was in the room with my dad and Hermione said something and my dad goes, "Oh, no wonder you like this movie. You're just like Hermione." And I was like, I think Hermione was saying something about not wanting to get expelled or something. And I was like, I don't care that much about getting expelled. But my dad was like, you're just like her. I was like, okay. I definitely relate to Hermione being the first one raising her hand in class to answer all the questions, reading all the books, all of her classmates being like, how do you know that? And she's like, well, I read it in a book. Like that was me in school. So I connected with that. But as far as female characters, I don't know. I think the series is blessed by Luna, who comes in the next book. So very happy for
Mhm.
Luna to come in. But yeah, I'm not thrilled with the way the women. It's so weird how like Mrs. Weasley and Mrs. Dursley are both housewives, and it makes me think of it must just be like Rowling's perspective, because probably when she was a child, most of the moms were housewives, right? They didn't have as many careers. So that feels kind of antiquated. Um
Yeah, our other female characters are Professor McGonagall, who is excellent but ancient, and um,
oh, the divination, the
the
whole
the
divination stuff.
divination teacher. Hmm.
And of course, it's like
Um,
Lavender and
not written with
Parvati.
a lot of, yeah, not written with a lot of respect there either. Um, you have Rita Skeeter, who is gorgeous but evil.
Yeah.
Vile, I should say, maybe not evil. So yeah, it is really hard to find the female role models in this series, or they live in a lot of stereotype.
Yeah.
Even Fleur, who, grows on you as the series continues, starts off in this kind of, she's portrayed as like vain and cold. Um, she finds the most attractive boy to take to the ball, even though she has no connection with him. So yeah, that's something that's kind of missing. It's like you really do only have a couple of female characters to look up to.
Yeah.
And Hermione is great because of her dedication, her studiousness, her boldness. Those things come out. But we're also forced to remember in this book that she is a girl. Open your eyes, Ron.
Yes.
She can put on beautiful dress robes and smooth her hair back and
Now,
be, you know, beautiful and worth pursuing. And that comes as a major shock to her friends.
well, to Ron, it's not clear to me how much Harry is agreeing with Ron in those parts. I just have to say, as someone with naturally curly hair, I do not approve of her straightening her hair for the ball. Like, find the curly girl method. Come on. But but yeah, like Ron, I think that's supposed to be setting up romance between Ron and Hermione, maybe. I mean, I think Rowling has said that she originally intended Hermione to end up with Harry, but then it didn't work out that way. Um, so yeah, I don't know how much Harry shares that reaction.
They're so squarely in the friend zone, and then there's no other male characters to evaluate Hermione other than Malfoy, who's making fun of her bushy hair and her big teeth.
Yeah. Now, does this story reflect the idea that we were raised in a world that no longer exists? I mean, Harry, I think this is related to the next genre theme, which is the hero's journey, which is like Harry was chosen to be special. Like he didn't ask for it. It's a really interesting framing of he grew up with the Muggle family and so didn't know he was special. And then he's chosen as a wizard and then he realizes that he's special. So when you have the hero's journey, I've shared this on the book club podcast social media. So if you're not following it on Twitter, please find us on Twitter. You can see the hero's journey image that I shared about being called and then having there's a lot we don't have to talk about it all. But like I think the big part that the pattern that I'm seeing in this season is the hero has to accomplish some goal and achieve something, and it changes the hero internally and it changes the greater society. And we see that in the full 7-book series of Harry Potter, but then we also see it in microcosm in this book. Harry is chosen to be a champion against his will, and he meets the challenge with help. And then as a result of him being the champion, Voldemort comes back, and that is a huge change for all of the world, basically, even for the Muggles who don't know anything about it. Um,
That's where it busts out of the microcosm again. It's like, oh, it was a microcosm. Like he was chosen as the hero, and it could have been something small within Hogwarts or within wizarding academia. But then, boom, you're in the graveyard. It's back to big picture, changing Harry's life, changing the world.
yeah. And so was Harry raised in a world that no longer exists? I mean, Harry represents the hope and the end of a war for the people who were alive when Voldemort, I guess he defeated Voldemort as a baby. And like, oh, and this is the book where we learn what that curse was that killed Harry's parents and the curse that he survived, right? We didn't know the name of that. I just love that layering of storytelling. It's just masterful. So Harry was raised in a world, first of all, he was raised with muggles. But then like when he enters the wizarding world, Voldemort is gone, right? Like there's nothing to be worried about. He learns that that's not true, but like I don't know, what does that say about the millennial experience that we thought we were born into a world of peace and prosperity? This may be a stretch. Tell me what you think.
I think we did have that impression growing up in the 80s and 90s. The world was a safe place for us. And now we're like, it would be nice if all of our dragons were in the form of dragons or Lord Voldemort. But instead, we are currently facing social issues that seem insurmountable, where you kind of ask, well, what could one person do about this huge problem?
Hmm.
You know, what can I do about war in Gaza? What can I do about climate change? What can I do to protect the rights of other people in my own country? Um, it's just our dragons aren't dragons.
Yeah.
um,
Yes, I that's true, but is that different with other generations?
I don't think so.
So it's a part of
But
growing up.
it's a part of growing up, but it's also a way for us to give a name to the roles we might play,
Hmm.
like a way to understand what our role might be in the world. That even if it's something small, like standing up and speaking at a city council meeting or voting or writing a letter to the editor, it's a small thing that you might need help along the way that might change you, that might have a larger change. So even if it's never as grand as Harry versus Voldemort or Frodo destroying the ring, those the small things we do in life are still hard and scary.
Okay, so let's talk about the movie. How about you go first, real quick?
Ooh, so because I read the book and then immediately watched the movie, all of the differences were just glaring at me. It felt like a flip book version of the novel I had just finished.
Yeah. I hate the movie. I hated it so much. And the reason why is that it gets so close to being perfect. Like it just like the cast is awesome. I love every single cast member. They're perfect. The setting is amazing. The music, I mean, it's so great. But then the writing or maybe it's the editing. If you don't read the book, you don't know what's going on in the movie, and that makes it a bad movie, right? They show these pieces from the book, but they don't really have any closure on it. The most egregious one I think is you have Hermione and Ron having a fight at the Yule Ball, and you have this heartbreaking scene of Hermione sitting on the stairs crying, and she says, "Ron, you ruined everything," and then nothing happens. Like there's no like payoff for that, and that just happens over and over again. There's no payoff with Rita Skeeter. They show her briefly, like they're just like flashing like a flip book, like you said, that they just, hey, you remember this from the book? Wasn't that great? And I felt that way about all the movies. I remember you used to watch the movies on DVD, and I would just like come into the room and you would be watching a Harry Potter movie, and I would just be like, ugh, Harry Potter movies, they're so bad. Do you remember that at all?
Well, I like to have movies on while I was cleaning. and doing other things. And because the books were so fresh in my mind, I could just fill in all the missing details. I could forgive the absences. And I think that's what was surprising when I watched the movie this time. I was like, "Oh, there's no Quidditch match. Oh, there's no Winky. What? He was
Yeah.
Crouch was there at the beginning." There were so many just glaring errors and omissions. And then you'd have these, like, there would be a scene where it would show this like beautiful setting, and as you said, like great characters, great acting, and a one liner, and they'd cut to a new scene.
Yeah.
Nothing would happen as they transitioned from scene to scene.
It was jarring.
Yeah.
One exception is the scene. I mean, I'm sure that they really had to get it right. They were really focused on it. Was the graveyard, right? Like that was done
Mhm.
really well. But I always felt this at the time too. I think that the movies really suffered because she hadn't finished writing the books when they started making the movies. And so you didn't, like, the movie makers had no way to know what would be the threads to emphasize early on. I really thought that that suffered.
It would be better done as a mini series.
Yes. The cast is so great. Like, I love how, I mean, oh my gosh, Rickman as Snape,
Oh, yeah.
genius. We'll never get Alan Rickman again.
They're going to have to wait a good 15 years before they recast it and do it as a mini series,
Yeah,
so that all of us who have fallen in love with these actors um, can move on enough to to accept someone else in the role.
right. Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to ask our listeners to subscribe on Substack and help support the show. You can have a paid subscription on Substack, and it's a small podcast. We need support just to do the bare bones minimum of producing an audio file and sharing it on the internet. So if you are able to share $5 a month or $5 a year, that would help the podcast continue, make sure we can do future seasons. If you become a paid subscriber before the end of this season on Millennial Nostalgia, you will have a chance to pick a book for a bonus discussion. So, Jenni, what are your final thoughts on Goblet of Fire?
To be honest, I struggled getting into this most recent reading, but by the time we made it past the Yule Ball and all of the drama that was shaping it towards the second half of the book, I really got sucked in. And by the time I finished, I was like, wow, this was really lovely. It was great to um, kind of be pulled back into Harry Potter's world for a little while.
Yeah, I loved it. I like, it's weird for me to read it out of order, so that kind of annoys me. And it was hard for me to not immediately pick up the next book as soon as I finished it. You know, I'm just used to them all
I'm
being.
considering reading book 5 now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to not just finish the story. It's just so well done. I was immediately like back in the world, and just like the texture of the world and the details, and even just like the physical. This is the same book I've had since I first bought it when it first came out. And just the feeling of the paper, the weight of the book, it just was just a full sensory experience that I just enjoyed so much. And really, really could appreciate even more just the technical storytelling, the skill in it. So, yeah, love.
Well, I should say that I find Harry and Ron spat at the beginning particularly painful, so that might have had something to do with my interaction with the
Oh,
beginning of the novel.
interesting. That's interesting. All right, we can't talk about that right now, but that's very interesting. Listeners, what do you think of the Harry Potter series as a whole? The Goblet of Fire in particular, other books by J.K. Rowling. What do you think of our millennial nostalgia topic? Let us know by recording a voice memo and emailing openingquestion@gmail.com. You can also comment on the Substack at bookclub.com. And you can find me on Twitter at book_club_pod and on Threads at CRoseJack. I will also link to those social media profiles in the show notes. So also, please, if you're enjoying the podcast, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help new listeners find the show. Our next book discussion will be about The Princess Bride by William Goldman. It's a really fun book. The next episode will come out in about a month. The Book Club podcast is produced by me, Carly Jackson. Music and audio production by Alex Marcus. Special thanks to Jenni Medley. And thanks for listening.